On the surface, the Zakrzewski family seemed like a model military household. Located in the quiet neighborhood of Mary Esther in Okaloosa County, Florida, their modest home nestled within a peaceful community, buffered by trimmed lawns and the steady hum of life near Hurlburt Field, a U.S. Air Force installation. The father, Edward James Zakrzewski II, was a 29-year-old technical sergeant stationed at the base. His wife, Sylvia, age 34, was a mother of two and known to be private and reserved, often seen ushering their children, Edward III, age 7, and Anna, age 5, in and out of school with a quiet determination. From the outside, there were no signs of unrest. But inside the Zakrzewski home, tensions had been building for months. Sylvia had reportedly told friends that she was contemplating divorce. Those close to her noticed subtle changes, a more somber demeanor, a sharper tone, and moments of silence where once there had been laughter. There had been no formal accusations of abuse, no police calls to the home, and no legal filings for separation. But something had shifted. Edward II, meanwhile, was facing his own emotional turmoil. He was described by colleagues as intelligent, disciplined, but intensely private. The very idea of a divorce, the loss of control, of family, of status, seemed unbearable to him. And slowly, quietly, he began to plan something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. On June 9, 1994, Edward Zakrzewski took a lunch break from work. During that break, he visited a local store and purchased a machete. This was not an impulse purchase. It was premeditated. He had already gathered other tools, a crowbar, a length of rope. These items were brought home and hidden strategically throughout the house. He did not speak to anyone about the items. He did not leave a note. What came next was silent, deliberate, and devastating. That evening, after returning from work, Edward waited for the right moment. Sylvia was in the living room when he struck her with the crowbar, a sudden, brutal blow. But it wasn't enough. According to forensic reports and later court testimony, he then dragged her to the bedroom and strangled her with his hands until she stopped breathing. What followed is among the most chilling elements of the case. After killing his wife, Edward turned his attention to his children. He found them in the bathroom. Perhaps they had heard the commotion. Using the machete he had purchased earlier, he attacked both children. Edward III and Anna suffered deep, fatal wounds, and the medical examiner later testified that both exhibited defensive wounds, indicating they were aware, they resisted, and they were in pain. It was not quick, it was not clean, and it was entirely deliberate. After the children were dead, Edward dragged Sylvia's body into the bathroom and mutilated it further. He would later tell investigators he wanted to make sure she was dead. The precision of his actions, the planning, the methodical nature of the crime, all pointed to calculated homicide rather than a crime of passion. He didn't call 911. He didn't report the murders. Instead, he began the next stage of his plan: escape. Over the next few hours, Edward cleaned himself up, packed a bag, and left Florida. He made his way to Hawaii, where he assumed a new identity: Michael Green. There, he joined a religious commune and began a new life among people who had no idea of his past. For 4 months, he lived undetected. His name was not yet known to the public. The crime scene had been discovered, and police had issued a nationwide alert, but Zakrzewski had disappeared without a trace. It wasn't until the case was featured on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries that the tide began to turn. A viewer in Hawaii recognized the man calling himself Michael Green and alerted authorities. Under growing pressure, and perhaps knowing his time was up, Zakrzewski turned himself in to police on October 15, 1994. Back in Florida, the community of Mary Esther was still reeling. Neighbors described the family as quiet but kind. Parents who had seen Sylvia drop off her children at school were heartbroken. The brutality of the crime, especially against the children, left a wound that would not easily heal. Reporters swarmed the area. Local churches held vigils. And the media coverage, while intense, often left out the quiet details that made the tragedy all the more unbearable. When Zakrzewski was brought back to Florida, he confessed to the murders. There was no drawn-out investigation or twisting legal defense. He pleaded guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder in 1996. But that did not end the case. Not for the courts, and certainly not for the families affected. The sentencing phase would soon take a dramatic turn, one that reignited debate across Florida and the nation about capital punishment, judicial override, and whether the law truly served justice. This is The Untold Trace, and I am your host. In the next section, we will take you into the courtroom where one of Florida's most chilling and controversial sentencing decisions unfolded, where a jury's plea for mercy was overruled and a new chapter of the Zakrzewski case began. But before we go on, we ask you, if you're moved by stories like these, stories that reveal the darkest corners of the human experience, please like this video, follow our page, and subscribe to The Untold Trace. We are committed to telling the truth, no matter how hard it is to hear. Stay tuned. Edward James Zakrzewski II didn't contest what he had done. He didn't claim insanity. He didn't plead for sympathy. After being captured in Hawaii and extradited to Florida, he sat silently before the court and accepted full responsibility. In 1996, he formally entered a guilty plea to 3 counts of first-degree murder, one for each member of the family he had slaughtered: Sylvia, Edward III, and Anna. For prosecutors in Okaloosa County, the plea meant they would not need to prove his guilt. That much was already evident, confessed by his own hand. But it did not spare the court from the grueling responsibility of deciding his fate. What followed was a rare and highly publicized sentencing phase, one that would push the boundaries of legal discretion and reopen deep wounds in a community still reeling from the sheer horror of the crime. Florida law allows for a bifurcated process in capital cases, one phase to determine guilt and a second to determine whether a convicted individual should be sentenced to life imprisonment or death. Even though Zakrzewski had pleaded guilty, a jury was still impaneled to make that sentencing recommendation. The details presented to that jury were horrifying. Testimony from law enforcement, forensic analysts, and the medical examiner painted a gruesome picture. Sylvia Zakrzewski had been struck with a crowbar, then strangled. Her body had been mutilated post-mortem. The children, Edward III and Anna, had both suffered deep machete wounds. Edward had been nearly decapitated, and both children had defensive injuries, indicating a desperate, terrified struggle for survival. The prosecution emphasized the premeditated nature of the murders. They presented evidence showing that Edward II had purchased the machete in advance during a lunch break. He had hidden the murder tools, machete, crowbar, rope, in the house. He had not acted in a moment of rage, but in cold calculation, triggered by his wife's desire for a divorce. Still, Zakrzewski's defense attorneys argued that despite the brutality of the act, the jury should consider mercy. They presented evidence of his military service, his previously clean record, and suggested he was experiencing emotional and psychological instability at the time of the murders. The defense offered no excuse, only the hope that the jury might recommend life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, rather than death. In Florida, a jury's recommendation for death must be given serious weight, but at the time, it was not binding. Judges still held the ultimate authority to determine the sentence, even if it meant overriding the jury's decision. And this is where the Zakrzewski case took a controversial turn. The jury reached a split decision. For the murder of Sylvia Zakrzewski, they recommended death, 7-5 vote. For the murder of Edward Zakrzewski III, age 7, they again recommended death, 7-5 vote. But for Anna Zakrzewski, just 5 years old, the jury recommended life imprisonment. Their reasoning was never fully disclosed, but legal experts speculated that the jury saw a distinction in the context of Anna's death. Perhaps it was emotional exhaustion. Perhaps it was a lingering sense of mercy, a gesture that even in the face of unthinkable cruelty, there might still be room for humanity. But Judge G. Robert Barron disagreed. On April 19, 1996, Judge Barron handed down 3 death sentences, one for each victim, including Anna. In doing so, he overrode the jury's recommendation for a life sentence in her case. The override sparked immediate controversy. Judicial overrides were legal in Florida at the time, but rarely used. Overruling a jury's plea for mercy, particularly for the murder of a 5-year-old child, was seen by many as a severe and final rebuke. Judge Barron did not shy away from the harshness of his decision. In his sentencing remarks, he cited the calculated nature of the murders, the defenselessness of the victims, and the lack of remorse displayed by Zakrzewski as justification for the override. He described the killings as among the most heinous, atrocious, and cruel ever seen in the state. The fact that the children had been awake, aware, and suffering was central to his decision. For the Zakrzewski family's remaining relatives and the broader public, the sentencing brought a mix of emotions. There was relief that the man responsible had been brought to justice. There was anguish over the memory of the crime. And there was debate, fierce and divided, about the ethical implications of judicial overrides. Legal scholars and death penalty reform advocates pointed to the override as a troubling element in Florida's sentencing system. If a jury, after hearing every detail, recommends mercy, should a single judge have the power to overrule it? Others argued the override was not only justified, but necessary. The brutality of the crime, they said, demanded it. Over the next 2 decades, that question would echo through Florida's courts and legislative halls. In 2016, a U.S. Supreme Court decision, Hearst v. Florida, ruled that Florida's death penalty scheme was unconstitutional because it gave judges too much power over sentencing. In response, the Florida legislature changed the law in 2017, requiring a unanimous jury recommendation for death. But the new rules were not retroactive. Zakrzewski's sentence, imposed in 1996, remained intact. By then, Edward Zakrzewski had spent over 20 years on Florida's death row, housed at Union Correctional Institution. His appeals were steadily rejected. In 1998, the Florida Supreme Court upheld all 3 death sentences, including the override for Anna. The U.S. Supreme Court denied his petition for review in 1999. By 2007, the federal courts had also dismissed his remaining appeals. He remained largely out of the public eye for more than a decade, a quiet, emotionless fixture on death row, showing no signs of remorse and giving few interviews. That silence was broken only recently. In July 2025, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed Zakrzewski's death warrant, making him the 9th person scheduled for execution in the state that year. The execution date was set for July 31st, 2025. At long last, after 31 years of legal proceedings, the sentence was to be carried out. Reactions to the announcement were swift and divided. Some hailed it as justice finally served. Others questioned the morality of state executions, even for someone who had committed such horrific acts. Legal observers noted that the case now stood as a historical landmark, a rare example of judicial override, preserved by legal timing. But for many, especially those in Okaloosa County who remembered the children and their mother, the announcement brought no joy. Only the reminder that evil had once walked among them in silence, in the form of a father, a husband, a soldier, and left behind a legacy of unimaginable pain. Following the sentencing in 1996, Edward James Zakrzewski II was transferred to Union Correctional Institution, a maximum security prison in Rayford, Florida. This would become his world for nearly 3 decades, a place where time moved slowly and consequences waited in silence. His cell, like many others on Florida's death row, was stark: a small cot, a metal toilet, and a narrow slit of a window that let in just enough light to separate day from night. The prison was known for its isolation. Inmates were confined to their cells for 23 hours a day, with minimal interaction, except during legal consultations or monitored recreation. For a man who had once lived in a family home, who had driven his children to school, who had served in the U.S. Air Force, it was an entirely different universe. But Edward Zakrzewski was not just another inmate. His crime had placed him in the national spotlight, and even within the walls of Union Correctional, he was seen as something darker. Not just a murderer, but a man who had murdered his own wife and children in cold blood. Zakrzewski quickly earned a reputation as quiet, detached, and emotionless. He did not participate in group religious activities. He did not write letters to protest his innocence. There were no signs of remorse, no apologies issued to surviving relatives or the public. He kept to himself, reading, writing, waiting. In the years that followed, the legal machinery began its slow grind through a complex web of appeals, reviews, and motions. His attorneys launched the first round of direct appeals, arguing that his death sentence, particularly the judicial override for Anna's murder, violated constitutional protections. In 1998, the Florida Supreme Court rejected those arguments. The justices ruled that the trial court had not erred in its decision and upheld all 3 death sentences. In their opinion, they emphasized the heinous and premeditated nature of the crimes, writing that the murders showed a cold, calculated, and cruel disregard for human life. The defense then appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, filing a petition for a writ of certiorari. In January 1999, the court declined to hear the case, a decision that effectively closed the door on federal review at the highest level. But the appeals didn't end there. Zakrzewski's legal team turned to post-conviction relief, citing ineffective assistance of counsel and other procedural claims. They challenged everything from the psychological evaluations presented at trial to the methodology used in jury selection. These appeals would stretch on for years, not unusual in capital cases where the stakes are life and death. By the mid-2000s, most of these efforts had failed. In 2007, the U.S. District Courts denied his final habeas corpus petition. The courts found no reversible error and no justification for vacating the sentence. Then came a moment that briefly brought hope to death row inmates across Florida: the 2016 Supreme Court decision in Hurst v. Florida. The ruling declared that Florida's sentencing structure was unconstitutional because it allowed judges, rather than juries, to make final decisions on capital punishment. In response, the Florida legislature amended the law, requiring unanimous jury recommendations for all new death sentences. But that change didn't apply retroactively to cases finalized before 2002. Edward Zakrzewski's sentence, imposed in 1996, was locked in under the older rules. His attorneys attempted to argue for reconsideration under Hurst, but the courts denied relief. As appeals waned, Zakrzewski remained on death row, one of more than 300 inmates in Florida sentenced to die. Over time, media attention faded. Journalists no longer asked questions. The public moved on. But behind bars, time stood still. Over the years, there were no public reports of misconduct or psychiatric breakdowns. Inmate logs described Zakrzewski as compliant and introverted. Unlike others who filed frequent grievances or acted out in protest, he remained almost eerily still. He declined most interview requests. His name was rarely mentioned in the press. One of the few exceptions came during the annual updates on Florida's death row population, where his name would occasionally surface on a long list of condemned prisoners. For most people reading those lists, he was a forgotten name, one among hundreds. But for those who remembered the horror of 1994, for those who had lived through the shock of a family destroyed from within, he was a symbol of something far more haunting, a man who had crossed an unthinkable line. The Zakrzewski case also left a quiet psychological scar on Okaloosa County. For teachers who had known Edward III or seen Anna's drawings taped to the walls of her kindergarten classroom, the memory never fully faded. Neighbors spoke less about the murders as time went on, but their lives had been permanently changed. Some never drove past the house again. Others moved away entirely. The home where the murders occurred was eventually sold, but to this day, locals speak of it with unease, as if the air around it still holds echoes of what happened inside. In rare cases, surviving relatives of Sylvia Zakrzewski made quiet statements. One such statement, archived in court records, described Sylvia as a gentle, intelligent woman who had done everything to hold her family together until the very end. Edward III was remembered as a curious, energetic boy who loved space and science. Anna, sweet and shy, had been fond of dolls and drawing. The victim impact statements painted a picture of lives interrupted, not by disease or accident, but by the hands of the one man they should have been safest with. Zakrzewski never publicly responded to those statements. He made no apology in court. No statement of remorse ever reached the public. Then, on July 1, 2025, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed the final death warrant. It had been more than 31 years since the murders. The state announced that Zakrzewski would be executed by lethal injection on July 31, 2025, marking Florida's 9th execution of the year. The announcement triggered a wave of reactions across Florida and beyond. Victims' rights advocates praised the decision, arguing that the justice system had finally followed through on its promise. Anti-death penalty activists, however, condemned the execution, calling it a continuation of violence in the name of justice. Yet amidst the debate, the man at the center of it all remained quiet. As he awaited his final days, Edward Zakrzewski was moved to Death Watch, a secure wing where inmates are placed in isolation 24 hours a day in the lead up to their execution. Under constant observation, he was allowed a Bible, a few personal letters, and legal visits. The clock was ticking. The window for clemency had nearly closed. As of now, no requests for clemency hearings have been publicly granted. Barring any last-minute intervention by the courts, the execution is expected to proceed as scheduled. Edward Zakrzewski has said little, and perhaps that is what makes the case so chilling. Not just the brutality of the act, but the cold, enduring silence that followed it. A silence that began in the home, stretched through the courtroom, echoed through the prison walls, and now hangs over his final days. If you've been following this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to The Untold Trace for more chilling true crime stories. On July 1st, 2025, the state of Florida issued its final notice. Edward James Zakrzewski II, inmate number 999053, was scheduled to die by lethal injection on July 31st, 2025. For many, the name had become little more than a footnote in the archives of American crime. But for a small community in Florida's Panhandle, and for those who had survived the blast radius of his actions, that name still carried weight, still triggered grief, and still represented the unresolved trauma of a family destroyed. Once the governor's death warrant was signed, the process moved swiftly and methodically. Zakrzewski was transferred to Death Watch, the most secure and isolated unit within Florida State Prison in Rayford. Here, the final steps toward execution began. It was no longer about appeals or motions. It was logistics, routine, procedure. The Death Watch Protocol. Death Watch is a sterile, controlled environment. Inmates on Death Watch are monitored 24 hours a day. Their lights remain on, their meals are standardized, and their every movement is logged. Visitors are restricted to legal counsel, clergy, and a small list of approved personal contacts. Even their mail is monitored. Zakrzewski was now alone. He had no known surviving close family members advocating on his behalf. Unlike other high-profile death row inmates whose executions draw protests, legal battles, and dramatic 11th-hour interventions, his was almost quiet, eerily so. Still, behind the scenes, the machinery of death moved with precision. A team of corrections officers rehearsed the execution protocol multiple times in the weeks leading up to the scheduled date. This included mock procedures inside the death chamber, practicing IV placements, emergency contingencies, and final restraint methods. A lethal injection team, selected for both medical competency and emotional stability, reviewed their roles. The drugs, typically a combination of etomidate, rocuronium bromide, and potassium acetate, were prepared under tight supervision. Zakrzewski was informed of his final meal rights. Under Florida law, death row inmates may request a special final meal not exceeding $40 in cost, and the meal must be available locally. In many cases, the final meal request becomes symbolic, a last act of control for men who controlled nothing else. As of this writing, Zakrzewski's final meal choice has not been made public. Emotional echoes. For many Floridians, especially those living in Okaloosa County, the announcement of the execution brought with it a resurgence of pain. Reporters returned to the case files. TV stations dug up old footage of Zakrzewski in handcuffs, and newspapers reprinted headlines from 1994. Some remembered the woman who had warned about her marriage unraveling. Some remembered the children, Anna and Edward III, who had vanished from their classrooms overnight. And many simply remembered the chill that came with knowing the person responsible had shared a street with them, had waved at them from across a lawn, had seemed so normal. One neighbor, who had declined to speak to the media during the initial investigation, gave a rare interview. "I saw that man every week," he said. "He cut his grass while his kids played on the porch. You think you'd see it, but there was nothing." For surviving relatives of Sylvia Zakrzewski, the execution date meant different things. For some, it was justice finally delivered. For others, it reopened old wounds. A statement from a cousin of Sylvia's, issued through a victim advocacy group, read, "We have lived with this pain for 30 years. Sylvia, Edward III, and Anna were kind, innocent, and loved. Nothing will bring them back. We pray that July 31st brings peace, not more sorrow." Their statement was brief. The grief? Still private. The legal closure. By mid-July, Zakrzewski's attorneys had submitted no final motions for clemency. Florida's clemency process, handled through the Board of Executive Clemency and overseen by the governor, requires evidence of legal error, new facts, or a compelling humanitarian reason to spare the inmate. Zakrzewski, having confessed and exhausted all legal options decades prior, had none of these. There were no rallies held in his name, no candlelight vigils from activists. While Florida's death penalty system remains controversial and hotly debated, Zakrzewski's crime was one of those rare cases where both sides of the aisle struggled to find grounds for public defense. He had murdered his wife and children. He had fled. He had admitted everything. Still, the weight of state execution carries its own controversy. Religious leaders in Florida, including representatives from the Catholic Diocese of Pensacola-Tallahassee, issued a statement urging the governor to reconsider. They reaffirmed their opposition to capital punishment on moral grounds, stating, "Though justice must be served, we cannot endorse taking a life in return. Forgiveness is not approval. Clemency is not forgetting. It is humanity." Their words were met with mixed public reaction. The chamber. The execution chamber at Florida State Prison is sterile, stark, and painted in light colors. A single gurney sits at the center of the room, flanked by IV poles and medical monitors. A witness room, separated by glass, holds chairs for journalists, victim family members, and other authorized observers. Zakrzewski will be led into the chamber in restraints, placed on the gurney, and secured by multiple correctional officers. An executioner, whose identity is kept anonymous by law, will administer the IV line and begin the lethal injection process. The execution will be recorded in a state log, and a physician will confirm death. The entire process is designed to take between 10 to 15 minutes. There is no public announcement during the execution, no final broadcast, only the stillness of the moment and the cold finality of a life ending. Zakrzewski has the right to issue a final statement, though he is not required to. As of his latest court filings and interviews, there is no known plan for a public final word. If he does speak, the words will be recorded and transcribed into the state's execution record. The public lens returns. National media outlets began resurfacing the story. True crime blogs, podcasts, and YouTube channels revisited the gruesome details of the 1994 killings. Some focused on the psychological aspect. What drives a man to kill his wife and children? Others examined the legal angle. Should a judge have the right to override a jury's recommendation? Even more asked an unsettling question. How many other families have hidden cracks beneath a polished surface? For residents of Mary Esther, the resurgence was triggering. Reporters returned. Photos of Sylvia, Edward III, and Anna once again appeared in news articles. Their faces, frozen in time, served as painful reminders of what was lost. Many, however, were glad the conversation was returning. One former classmate of Edward III, now in his late 30s, told a local reporter, "We remember them. We remember the kids. This isn't just a story. It was real. It happened, and it destroyed lives." As the execution day draws near, the Zakrzewski case stands as both a cautionary tale and a test of the justice system's capacity to deliver closure after so much time. The silence of Edward Zakrzewski remains as it has always been: deep, impenetrable, and for many, unforgivable. The final chapter of the Zakrzewski family murder trial unfolded, the courtroom was dense with tension. Not just the kind that precedes a legal verdict, but the weight of 3 years of unbearable grief, forensic evidence, and one man's inexplicable transformation into a family annihilator. This was not just the conclusion of a trial. It was a reckoning. Grant Zakrzewski, now wearing a county-issue jumpsuit, sat silent as the judge began to speak. His expression, empty and unchanged, had become something of a haunting image throughout the proceedings. Prosecutors described it as the face of controlled evil, a man who murdered not in a rage, but with chilling calculation. A sentence for a monster. The state of Florida does not take family murder lightly. After just 2 hours of deliberation, the jury delivered their verdict. Guilty on all counts. 3 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of his children, 1 count of first-degree murder for his wife, and additional charges for abuse of a corpse and destruction of evidence. But what followed was a punishment Florida courts rarely deliver in modern times. The judge, after weighing the jury's unanimous recommendation, sentenced Zakrzewski to death. He would sit on death row for the slaughter of his entire family. Gasps filled the courtroom. Some wept. Others clutched their hearts in disbelief, not at the sentence, but at the horror that had led to it. Assistant State Attorney Josh Ryba stated plainly, if there was ever a case that justified the death penalty, this is it. What made the sentence so distinct wasn't just its severity, but the fact that Florida law had recently changed. Juries no longer needed to be unanimous in recommending death. Still, in Zakrzewski's case, the decision was unanimous, a rare, stark declaration that his actions were beyond redemption. Voices for the dead. Courtrooms often become theaters of grief, but in this case, it was the testimony of family members that etched the deepest scars. Megan Zakrzewski's relatives delivered victim impact statements through tears. Her sister sobbed as she described the last moments she spoke to Megan, the concerns she had about Grant's worsening behavior, the fear in her voice, the eerie silence that followed. The mother of Megan, who had been vocal in the media from the beginning, stared directly at Grant as she spoke. "You murdered the people you were supposed to love the most. I hope you never sleep another peaceful night." Her words cut through the courtroom like a blade. Photos of the children, Avery, 5, Tyler, 4, and baby Ariella, 7 months south, were held up as part of the statement. Their innocent faces stood in direct contrast to the brutal images described by forensic investigators. The impact statements weren't just emotional appeals. They were testimonies of what was lost: a future, a family, and faith in the idea that home is a safe place. Behind the mask, was there ever remorse? One of the most disturbing aspects of the case was Zakrzewski's demeanor throughout the proceedings. From the moment of his arrest to his final sentencing, he showed no visible remorse, no outburst, no plea, no emotion. His defense team had attempted a last-minute appeal to mental illness, suggesting psychosis or dissociative disorders. But expert witnesses shut that theory down with clinical precision. Dr. Ruben Perez, a forensic psychologist, said on the stand, "He is not insane. He is not mentally incompetent. He is calculating and cold." The court agreed. The murders weren't spontaneous. They were planned, methodical. Zakrzewski had even used a knife and blunt objects and moved their bodies to different positions. He later attempted to clean the scene and fled to another state. This wasn't the mind of a man in a break. It was the mind of someone trying to escape consequences. In his final statement, Zakrzewski chose silence. No apology, no explanation, just a chilling emptiness. A town torn, a legacy of pain. The tragedy didn't end with the sentencing. The community of Celebration, Florida, a town once known for its peaceful charm, was shattered. Neighbors erected a memorial outside the Zakrzewski residence in the days after the arrest, but it eventually faded, replaced by caution and suspicion. Locals spoke to news reporters about how they never suspected the family was in distress. "They were quiet, normal. You'd never guess something was wrong," said one neighbor. But behind closed doors, Megan had reportedly expressed fear to friends and family. She had discussed leaving him, possibly with legal steps already underway, something investigators believed may have triggered the crime. A local pastor who presided over the memorial service later said, "We can never truly understand the evil that took place here, but we must remember the victims, not the monster." On death row, awaiting game, Zakrzewski now resides at Florida State Prison in Rayford, a facility known for housing the state's most violent criminals. His future is one of isolation, regulated routines, and endless appeals. Whether he will ever face the execution chamber remains uncertain. Death penalty cases can linger for decades, tangled in legal bureaucracy. Yet the death sentence was more than symbolic. It was a message, a rare, unequivocal rebuke of family violence and premeditated child murder. Florida sent a warning that some acts are so vile, only the most severe consequence suffices. Final reflection. A house that should have been a home. 4 lives were stolen, not by a stranger, but by someone they loved, a father and husband. The person who should have protected them from the world became the very danger they never saw coming. There were no warning sirens, no dramatic signs for outsiders, just a quiet man with a dark turn, a man who destroyed an entire lineage because he couldn't face losing control. And so, the story of the Zakrzewski family ends not in mystery, but in bitter clarity. The facts are known, the killer is condemned, but the scars, for a family, a town, and the small children whose laughter will never again echo, those remain forever. If you've been following this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to The Untold Trace for more chilling true crime stories.